Hello, everybody. Welcome to this video on gut and COVID-19. We are dedicating this episode to all the people who have given up their lives for the COVID-19, and also a big shout out to all the people who are in the front line. Not just healthcare workers, it's also those people who are delivering your provisions, those people in retail who are still, facing this risk. So I have two wonderful guests with me here today. One is Dr. Debojyoti Dhar. He is the co-founder of a company called Lucian Rich Bio in India, which is one of the first companies in Southeast Asia looking at the gut microbiome. And my other wonderful guest is Dr. Vijaya Gauri, who is a pediatrician and a pediatric immunologist. So Dr. Dhar and Vijaya, I'll let you introduce yourselves. Debojyoti, would you just say a few words
Sure,
about
sure, sure.
what you do and your background?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Kerr, for the kind invite, and this is really a pleasure. To give a brief background about myself, I'm a PhD. I've done my PhD from Indian Institute of Science. I'm basically a molecular biologist. But for the last 5 years, I've been running a company called Lucian Rich Bio, as mentioned by Dr. Kerr, which is into primarily microbiome. So we are South Asia's first microbiome company, and we have commercialized South Asia's first microbiome test, rather a gut microbiome test called BugSpeaks. So the expertise that we bring on the table is genomics, molecular biology, big data analytics, and of course, a lot of biology. So gut microbiome is an emerging field, and as we all know, and we would rather discuss also in this episode, it's linked to a lot of diseases, both chronic and infectious. So with that, thank you, Dr. Kerr, for the kind introduction.
Oh, you're welcome, Debojyoti. Vijaya, will you say something about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Shabnam, for a wonderful opportunity. Pediatrician for a very, very long time, for almost 14 years. And then I got an opportunity to do pediatric immunology fellowship, and I have successfully completed it and have realized that everything boils down to immunology. If our basics of immunology is clear, I think half the problems since last 14 years, I think I was not treating my patients right, or rather, I had no clue about what I was going about. I was lucky that there was never a complication, and probably I did not miss out a primary immune deficiency. That's a sheer luck. Having said that, immune deficiencies are not rare. We just need to look out for them. Similarly, whatever is happening, whether it is a viral infection or a bacterial infection or an endemic or a pandemic or an epidemic, everything basically boils down to immunology. If we know what we are treating, I think then only we are going to be successful. We cannot beat around the bush when it comes to treatment.
Thank you, Vijaya.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Vijaya is very humble, so I describe her as a medical detective. So she can, find out about the rarest of rare diseases and, of course, the most, simple ones as well. So just a few things that I wanted to state at the beginning of this episode was, Vijay, you're so right about the immune system. And back when I was in med school, which was a long, long time ago, we didn't study a lot about the immune system at all. I'm having to learn now. And you are so right. Everything is a problem of the immune system. So the few things that we do know, and how is the gut related to the COVID-19 situation, few papers came out, and there have been so many papers coming out. One thing I just wanted to state, I will post a link to the papers we talk about, so you don't have to go looking for them anywhere. This is to our audience. And the other thing is, one thing you need to remember is a lot of the papers have not gone through the peer-reviewed process, which means they haven't gone through a due diligence to check exactly whether how much of it is true. The point being not that the authors wanted to, provide wrong information. It's just that because this is so new, so once the process goes through with the peer review process, some of the information may change. We are recording this on 21st of April. And I'm in Alberta in Canada. Debojyoti is in Bangalore. Vijaya is in Mumbai. And I think I didn't introduce myself, actually. So I am Dr. Shabnam Daskar. I am a specialist in functional and metabolic medicine. And my areas of focus, one of the main ones is autoimmunity and the other one is metabolic dysfunction. And I was an OBGY for many, many years in India, in Mumbai. That's how I got to know Dr. Vijaya. And so the things that we know and what set us, to invest our time here together to, just talk about a few things. Some of the things that I want to, bring up right up front is three of us are not at the front line of, dealing with the COVID-19 situation. But these are the things that we thought were relevant. Number one is, Vijay, I'll let you describe what does the coronavirus, what is it like named, and what is going on with the virus? How does it infect the body? And more importantly, one question which I think a lot of people are asking is, what does it mean that the virus is undergoing changes? So, Vijay, over to you.
See, the very important thing when it is always an interaction between the host and the environment. By host, we mean us, and also the innumerable organisms. Rather, for that matter, the animals are also hosts. And it is an interplay between the host and the environment, which would indicate what kind of balance is stuck, what kind of an immune response or a capacity to fight against any infection is achieved at, or to protect yourself. Immunity does not mean you have to fight. Immunity is protection also. So if we see what is an immunological disease, immunological disease is not just immune deficiency, it is autoimmunity, it is malignancy, everything. These are three arms of immunology. So you have a primary immune deficiency, not the ones which are acquired. So a primary and a malignancy. All three are the three important arms of immunology. Now, what about people who don't have any kind of an immune deficiency? That host is also going to come across viruses and bacteria or fungi for that matter, the entire microbiome, and they would react to it differently. Every virus for that matter, because we are talking about viruses, I'll restrict myself to virus. Every virus has got its own survival strategy. This is something which is very important, and based on its own survival strategy, the response of the body also differs. When it comes to COVID-19, with one very important thing, people have been talking about COVID-19 affecting the respiratory system, COVID-19 affecting the gut. One very important thing which I realized when I was giving this examination for immunology was the mid-gut and the respiratory tract have the same embryological vestigial origin. So the receptor which is there in the mid-gut.
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to pause a little while and explain what some of the things that you're saying. To many people may not be aware of all the immunological things. So when, Vijay, you're saying a primary immunological deficiency, that is not something that is very common and an adult would be dealing with. Versus the generic sort of, do you have a strong immune system that people talk about? So immune system cannot be strong or weak or anything. It's just that, is it helping you? Is it harming you? So the simpler term would be resilience is what I would think of this as. And the other thing is what you're talking about, so this is the interesting part that really got my thinking, this thing. There is a big connection between the gut and the lung. So the gut-lung axis is what Vijaya is talking about. So embryologically, that means when you were a baby in your mother's uterus and all your different systems were growing and, developing. So that is so fascinating, Vijaya. I had no clue about that the mid-gut and the lung, you said, have a common embryological origin?
Yeah, I was not aware about it either. Okay. It is only when I was going to appear for this examination and I thought, I don't know what kind of examiner is going to come and what kind of questions they are going to pose. That is when I started reading about COVID. And then I realized that people are saying that a lot of patients come with diarrhea. There are a lot of patients who come with, and then I was always confused. that there were people who were saying that the patient has got a surfactant deficiency because pneumatocyte type 2 are affected, not the type 1. And but when you look at pneumatocyte type 2, okay, I'm sorry, I'm jumping from one place to another. There are so many thoughts which are crowding my mind. But at the same time, one very important thing is when everything boils down to embryology. So if you have an embryological origin which is similar for two organs of the body, you have all the receptors which are also similar to two organs of the body. We just need to remember that. So if you have your esophagus up to ileum, mid gut, ileum, which is coming out of the same mesoderm, ectoderm, endoderm origin as the respiratory tract and the lungs, we have the same receptors there on both the surfaces. So whatever affects the lung is possibly going to affect the gut also, and we will see a similar kind of response at both the places. Just that when you have a respiratory tract affection, you will have respiratory symptoms. When you have a gut affection, you will have a gut symptom. That is very important. That is why receptor ACE2 receptor is not just seen in the respiratory tract, it is also seen in the gut, esophagus up to the ileum and also colon. So that is very important. So gut-lung axis comes from there. It is embryologically same ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm combination. It has come from the same place, therefore same receptors.
Okay.
That
so
is why, and similarly, renal, hepatorenal. So when you have a renal affection, you have a liver affection. When I spoke about liver, I just want to tell you something. The cholangioles, the ducts which are formed from the liver to the gallbladder, the cholangioles are derived from the same mesoderm.
Wow.
So when you have a COVID-19 affecting the liver, you have cholestasis. It is cholestatic hepatitis, which will manifest over a period of time. Unfortunately, patient doesn't survive for that long to see cholestasis. Suppose if there is somebody who is going to come with a secondary infection, or he is going to manifest, as in China, we are seeing that the patient got treated, went back home and have come back again, probably will come with cholestasis because cholangioles have a similar origin from the same mesoderm and endoderm combination.
Wow.
So it's very, very interesting.
So, Vijaya, before we move on to the change in the RNA virus and all that, how normal is it that is expected? I'll just, Debojyoti, would you like to add something to that? Vijaya, that is so fantastic an explanation.
Yeah, I mean, so as Dr. Vijay was pointing out, so the gut-lung axis is something which is well, researched in the animal models. But there are certain anecdotes or anecdotal evidences that this exists experiment-wise in humans as well. I'll just cite one small example here. It was found that patients or infants, or not even infants, children with allergy or asthma, they have increased TNF alpha and CRP in their blood.
Sorry,
And that,
I'm going to interrupt you again. Not everyone may know what is TNF alpha and what is CRP. So will you just explain? I'll keep interrupting both of you.
These are pro-inflammatory markers. So they were found to be upregulated in the blood. And incidentally, all the patients had a gut dysbiosis. When I say gut dysbiosis, what I mean, see the gut, right? So before we get onto the gut microbiota and all those things, let me step a few steps back. See, initially the microbiology era, which started in 90s or early 2000s, they were hampered by the fact that not all microorganisms could be cultured. And therefore, we knew very little of the microorganisms. And those microorganisms which were actually cultured also needed various different growth media, which probably was not available in all the labs, and all those paraphernalia were absent. Now things started to change with the advent of something called as next generation sequencing. Now with next generation sequencing, we the scientists, the researchers need not culture any microorganisms. They just need to take the DNA, sequence it, and when you take the DNA and sequence it, you would come to know which microorganisms were present, because the DNA is coming, this genetic material is coming from that aspect. So with the advent of NGS, the microbiology or the microbiome field, exploded. And now you have all the research which is happening, the gut-lung axis, the gut-liver axis, the gut-brain axis, the gut-scheme axis, all these axes, what we are mentioning right now, is mainly because of the advent of NGS and the power that it gives us to, look at all the microorganisms. Now, coming back to the gut-lung axis, as Dr. Vijay and Dr. Kar is mentioning, this is a very unique and interesting, link that was probably hidden from the mainstream, scientific community. Thanks to COVID-19, that axis is now getting a lot of interest. To add one more example, syncytial virus, which causes upper respiratory tract infection. It was shown that when you have infection with that particular virus, it decreases appetite. And the way it does, they had done some very good research on, this was on animal models, but they had found, what is the mechanism by which it is doing. So yes, so that probably exists, and it is, and by the way, it's a bidirectional axis. It's not like, it's from the lung to the gut. It is also from the gut to the lung. So as we move on, we can discuss much more on that.
So thank you, Devalita. That was wonderful. And so Vijaya, moving on to what is the type of virus, RNA virus, DNA virus, and the change in the type of virus, what is going on, what is true, because a lot of people are very concerned that the virus is undergoing change. But from my limited knowledge, I thought that was kind of normal. Vijaya?
See, if we go by Darwinian theory also, it is important that to survive, you have to mutate. And we have all mutated over a period of time to an extent that the basic axis, which was dividing us from the microbiota, is already breached. So we are as much a part of microbiome as microbiome is a part of us. So we did, when we were in our hospital at Wadia Children's Hospital, we did we sent a nasopharyngeal swab for most of our PID patients. And you won't believe that in a nasopharyngeal biofire, we would see norovirus. Respiratory syncytial virus is something which we have seen always, but we have seen norovirus also, Boca virus. The viruses which I never thought of, or which in pediatrics I always left thinking that I wouldn't have to read it again, have become a part of our microbiota. That's because of our, basically the line is breached. So that is the reason. Now what happens, every virus, viruses can broadly be divided into a DNA virus and a RNA virus. And what we are, pandemic, because RNA virus, beta subtype, capacity to get attached to the surface of endothelial cell, which are there inside our various organs of our body. They are endothelium. What we have on the surface is an epithelium. What we have underneath the surface is a mesothelium, and what we have inside the organs, the linings, they are the endothelium. Endothelium has got various receptors, lung, gut, because they are, and the skin, because they are the organs of our body, the largest organs of the body, which comes in contact with various microbiomes. Dr. Dhar would be able to explain it much better than me. But as they come across these, and since these are the places which come across these organisms or the viruses, they have all the receptors to which these viruses can actually get attached to. They gain entry into the endothelial cells, and from there on starts the process of translation, and then the viral capsid formation, and then the cells explode and the virus is released into the circulation. Multiple mechanisms through which they do. But now that we are hearing about a lot of receptors here, we have ACE2 receptor to which it gets attached. And there is another receptor, which is a serine threonase receptor, basically, and to which it gets attached. Both the receptors have to be present to have a proper coronavirus infection. If it gets attached to one of the viruses, it won't be capable of causing an infection. And I think such people are actually carriers. We are yet not sure about it, but I think such people are carriers. The others who have both the receptors to which the virus can actually get attached and gain an entry into the host endothelium turn out to be a coronavirus infection. Dr. Dhar, if I am wrong somewhere, please correct me.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's a paper which had come up, I think, in Gut. It's a
Yes.
BMJ publication where they had
Yes.
shown it's a single cell analysis. What they had done, they had taken, and I think they had also looked at 81 and 82 alveolar cells, where they had found that the presence of the serine threonine protease, that one, I think TARMPSS, something of that.
TARMPSS, yes.
Yes. And they had found that these two, ACE2 as well as this protease receptors, they are present together in cells, and presence of these two receptors is important for the COVID SARS-CoV-2 virus to infect those cells. So that is right, absolutely.
And another interesting paper which I read today was in pediatric population, the serine threonine receptor is absent.
Oh.
In less than 5-year-old children, it is not, and I'm not saying it is absent, it is subcytoplasmic. It is not on the surface. It is not on the surface of the cell, but it is subcytoplasmic, or it is intracytoplasmic. As a result of which the kids are not getting affected. That explains why the children are not getting affected. I think so. But then these are things there are so many things which I have read. I'm not sure what is right, what is wrong. But then probably this explains why kids less than 5 years are not getting affected in spite of being very close to the patient or the mother or the father who is actually infected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vijaya. I mean, we could talk until kingdom come. This is so interesting, and love the intellectual, challenge and all of that. So the question that I wanted Vijaya for you to answer is, so what does it really mean that the virus is changing and it's not changing? The interesting thing that you brought up about how the humans have incorporated parts of the virus and bacteria and everything into our bodies. This change has not happened overnight. This has happened over millions of years. Just this thing for our audience. And another thing is, I just wanted to mention to our audience that sometimes our voices and all that may go a little off the air and all that. That's not our fault. We can't help it. It's the internet connection. So Vijaya, does it mean that the virus is changing? And what are the implications from that, from a perspective of treatment or a vaccine or any of that?
Okay, see, changing rather we would call it a mutation, and mutation can affect us in two ways. One, because of mutation, it becomes more pathogenic, it becomes more virulent, or we can have strains which are less virulent, less pathogenic. Almost 3 to 4 substrains. In the 4th substrain, they have already found it corona. It is the change in the genomic sequence which can occur, which would make it either more virulent or less virulent. And it's difficult to say as to the number of strains, because Dr. Dhar, please let me know, because we have not been able to type EBV virus in India. I doubt if we are typing COVID in India. We have not been able to type EBV type 1, 2, and 3 because we have rampant EBV infection. We have not been able to type it. I doubt if we are typing corona. Of course, our virologists are doing an excellent job, but from what I got to know from Dr. Mohanty, who is a virologist at Hafkins, that we have 2 strains in circulation in Mumbai, and there has been a change in the original strain. When there were patients who came to Mumbai and they started isolating it, the strain which is in circulation right now is a different form of strain, which is not the same as the original one. But what is the level of pathogenicity is difficult for us to
So
understand.
I think yesterday, I think I saw one paper from India where they looked at that. Devojyoti, am I right?
Not sure about that Indian paper, but there was a paper. I mean, all the papers are recent, so
Yeah.
relatively speaking. So there was one paper. I think someone from Europe had published. They had typecasted the virus into three typical, strains A, B, and C, and they wanted to look at their origin and how they have shifted. And if my memory serves me right, they had found that the strain in the US and the Europe and let's say the Singaporean strains are different. So I've forgotten the crux of that paper, but that's what they had done. So the genotyping of the viruses or the strains are happening as we speak. And as Dr. Vijay is saying, maybe the Indians are also working on the same aspect. This is a topic, Dr. Kar, it's very controversial right now because the origin of the virus is still in doubt. Of course, the current academic thought is that this virus has come from the bats because the sequence identity with the bat virus is pretty high, and then there is an intermediate called pangolin, which is a which also known to have the same kind of virus. But there are other theories also, which we will get into the conspiracy angle. So that's why I didn't want to get into that.
Yeah. So that's right, Devojyoti. What you brought up is, again, I am not a virologist. My knowledge in this is just going by what I'm reading. So what I understand is most people who know what they're talking about have been saying that it's unlikely to be a lab grown one. But again, like I said, I'm not knowledgeable in that. I think for now we'll leave that, because again, I don't want to get into conspiracy theory and all that, because whatever the cause was, the issue now is how are we going to deal with it? What does it mean for us in the future as practitioners and all of that, which is much more relevant. So Vijay, what do you think? Sorry, go ahead.
Can I add one thing here? And taking up from where Dr. Vijay had left. See, there are two aspects, and as a person who is looking at the gut microbiome, this is a theory that I think I would rather put it on record. You see, there are three aspects or three vulnerable sections of patients, right? One is the elderly, one is the immunocompromised. Basically these two. I mean, most of these patients are going into the complications of the disease, which is respiratory distress and pneumonia and so on and so forth. Now, if you take one part of your gut microbiome, one aspect of your gut microbiome, which is called gut diversity, into picture, then you would see that it makes sense, because it is a well-known fact that with age, your gut microbiome diversity decreases. It is also known that in many immunocompromised patients, the gut microbiome diversity decreases. Now, as we speak, we know that gut microbiome diversity, when I say diversity, it means, it's like if you have an example of genetic pool, more the genetic pool is enriched, the better it is. Similarly, more the diverse your gut microbiota, the better it is. Not always, but that is the general norm. Now, if you can put these two things into the picture and try to complete the puzzle with also the receptors taking a center stage, like Dr. Vijay was saying, that the infants or the children who have less ACE2 receptors on their cell surface, and then you put this gut microbiome diversity also into the picture, then everything then starts making sense. And then again, the gut-lung axis becomes quite relevant. So coming to that point, that the gut diversity, these vulnerable section of the society which is facing the maximum clinical manifestation or the thing of this disease, there's possibly a link with the gut microbiome.
Thank you, Devojyoti. So just one thing I just wanted to mention is we've been talking about the gut microbiome with the assumption that everyone knows what it is. So Debojyoti, I think I'll just ask you to explain and you've done it more often than me, what the gut microbiome is. And one more thing I just wanted to add to your, comment on elderly and the immunocompromised. The highest risks have been the ones with comorbidities. So that means the ones who've had other diseases.
Correct.
Diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, these were the main ones. And so the thing is, in all those conditions, Debojyoti, the gut microbiota is not healthy. So will you just explain absolutely in basic terms, what is the gut microbiome? And then later on, I'll talk about how you can manipulate it. I'll focus mostly on the stuff that you can control. Things like genetics, you cannot control. So Debojyoti, over to you to explain what the gut microbiome is.
Yeah, so the gut microbiome and gut microbiota, these are the two terms which are interchangeably used, but they are actually two different terms. See, the gut microbiota is the sum total of all the microorganisms present in the gut. When I say all microorganisms, I mean fungus, virus, bacteria, bacteriophage, amoeba, so on and so forth, right? Gut microbiome is basically the sum total of the genome of all these microorganisms put together. So they mean the same thing, but technically they are different, right? So, so the gut microbiota, basically, as we were all discussing, is a sum total of good, bad, ugly microorganisms present in the gut, right? And when we say dysbiosis or eubiosis, what do we mean? So the term eubiosis is a healthy balance of all the microorganisms, good, bad, and the ugly. And every one of us has that balance. To some extent, the balance tilts towards the bad, then it becomes dysbiotic. If it is completely balanced, then we call as eubiotic. So dysbiosis is something which happens when there's more abundance of, let's say, pathobionts or abundance of microorganisms which can lead to increased inflammation in the gut. Okay. Now, then we use the term dysbiosis. Now, when I say dysbiosis, the balance goes awry. That means the good microorganisms do not have the potential to keep check on the bad microorganisms. And when the bad microorganisms grow more, they can cause a lot of problems. And as Dr. Kar, you were mentioning, the third category of people which I started off was actually type 2 diabetic, hypertensive, and obese, comorbid patients. And in all those patients, there are plenty of reports which suggest that there is dysbiosis or there is the gut microbiota is not in shape. Okay, but there's always a debate whether it's a cause or an effect. That's a different debate that we can debate on a different platform or a different day. But yes, the gut dysbiosis definitely plays a role in all the comorbidities. And also, as I said, the diversity plays a role in immunocompromised and elderly people. And if you put one and one together, it makes sense, especially in COVID-19.
Yeah. Thank you, Debojyoti. So just a few things I'll add to that. So how I explain to patients is it's not just what bacteria are there in your gut, because the bacteria's genetic material is also interacting with your genetic material. It's also who they are with and what are they doing. So three things. One is, so Debojyoti, just correct me if I'm wrong. What I understand is there are a lot of, bacteria present in the gut, which sometimes are not shown to cause a disease, but they are hanging around. So one is that. And what are they doing to the other bacteria? That is also very important. Absolutely. And more importantly, they secrete substances which we call microbial metabolites. Those metabolites are also very important. Now, we can go on and on talking about the gut microbiome. I think we're going to have that as a separate session. So who is present? Who are their friends and what are they doing together is how I describe it. So it's not like you have one particular type of bacteria and that is a healthy bacteria. No, it's also important about who they are with. So I hope it's clear what I'm trying to explain. So it's not just which are the bacteria present. There are, I think, what is the last number? Because every time I have to change my slide. I think the last was 1,200 different types so far identified.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing that Debojyoti was mentioning about immunocompromised in elderly. So what happens in the elderly is the type of bacteria, the diversity changes. So that's probably a part of, the normal aging process. But in the interest of time, I'm going to go back to Vijaya now. So Vijaya, one of the things we are taught is that the gut is the biggest immune organ in the body. So the mucosal immune system, will you just explain, very briefly? So the mucosa is there in the lungs as well, and it's there in the vagina as well. So many different areas where the mucosa is present, and that is one of the first barriers that any, not even harmful, any bacteria, virus, or any such substance comes across. So Vijaya, will you explain a little bit about, the mucosal immunity in the gut and in the lung as well?
Okay. See, basically, mucosa, an intact mucosa acts as a barrier against all infections or invasion by any infective organisms. We just need to remember that. But apart from that, we need to remember that gut has got lymphoid follicles, which are there in our Peyer's patches. These lymphoid follicles develop at the same time when our lymph nodes are developing, when the thymus is developing. Developmentally, they are all of the same. They are originating from the same place, migrating to various other places. So they would have gone to Peyer's patches. They would have gone to the white pulp of the spleen. A few of them would have gone to the lymph nodes. A few of them would have gone to thymus, the germinal center of the thymus where the B cells would develop. And everywhere, at all these places, the various development of lymphoid organs or the lymphoid progenitors would develop at many of these places apart from the bone marrow. That is why we're looking at the surface area of the gut. If you remember that it covers one full basketball court, if we open it, then they look at the number of lymphoid follicles in the Peyer's patches which are there, which indicates that that's the largest lymphoid organ of our body. And since when we eat, when we swallow, we have our saliva, starting from our saliva itself, we have lysozymes, we have lecithins, we have lot of substances present in our saliva, which itself act as a mucosal barrier, which coats the tongue, which coats the mucosal surfaces of the mouth, prevents invasion by the microorganisms. And also they are fungicidal. They have this capacity to be fungicidal. So none of us develop oral thrush so easily. We wouldn't have developed oral thrush in our lifetime. In my 49 years of life, I don't think I have developed oral thrush. So normally we don't develop oral thrush because saliva has got a fungicidal property also. And then when we swallow, the stratified epithelium of the esophagus per se is such a good mucosal barrier that even if you end up swallowing one big piece or a big chunk of food which is not fully cooked, which is not fully chewed or not properly chewed, would not damage the esophagus, because that is the level of interaction which our body has with the surrounding or the environment, and expecting that these are the things which are going to happen. Our epithelium is designed in such a way that it can take the brunt of whatever is happening. And as we eat, as we grow, as we drink, our mucosal mechanisms evolve in such a manner that the lymphoid organs of the intestine, the Peyer's patches, the germinal centers evolve, the B cells develop, they throw in antibodies, and the IgA gets secreted, not just from the gut epithelium, but also from the respiratory tract. And it is the IgA, immunoglobulin A, which provides us the basic baseline immunity against most of the invading microorganisms which we breathe, which we eat, and which we drink.
Thank you, Vijaya. So that was excellent. And for the audience, if any of these terms are difficult for you to understand, don't worry. We'll post notes which will have the basic definitions. And so moving forward, now the things that impact the gut microbiome and of course the gut-lung axis. Now we know that because this is a respiratory virus, most of the serious infections and people who have died have been from respiratory failure. Am I right? Some have been from cardiac failure as well. So going forward with that, so respiratory failure is one of the events that happens with the coronavirus. However, we are talking today about what are the things you can do, to impact the gut microbiome and hopefully along with that, the gut-lung axis as well. So one of the things that we've found out from the recent studies is that smokers did much worse. So obviously smokers did not have a healthy immune system in the lung. That was one of the reasons, because the virus enters through there. And the other thing is, so one of the best things which is happening already is, because of the lockdown, you are not exposed to a lot more of the environmental toxins because of the the smoke, and all of you have probably received enough forwards of where the animals are coming out and all that. So, and the pollution levels are much lower, so which is good. So one more reason for if you're feeling awful about being on lockdown in India, this is good for you. So you are safe at home, not stuck at home, as someone said. So that is one thing. Now, moving forward, Debojyoti, again, the gut microbiome can be impacted by many things, but I am a control freak, and as a clinician, I'm going to look at things. What are the things I can control? So one of the things, big ones that impact the gut microbiome is the food you eat. And the other thing is, of course, all the medications you take. And now, of course, we are not suggesting stop your medications. No, that is not what we are talking about. And incidentally, we can go on and on about that. The medications that impact the gut microbiome are not just antibiotics. There are a whole lot of others as well. One thing I just wanted to mention, Vijaya, in relation to the mucosal immunity. So obviously the level of mucosal immunity would also depend on the thickness of the mucosal layer. Am I right? Vijaya and Debojyoti? I think Vijay has frozen. So the other thing is, one of the common medications is the proton pump inhibitors, drugs like omeprazole, lansoprazole, those things.
There it is.
Yeah, so those would impact the mucosal lining. Correct me if I'm wrong, Vijay, am I right? So that is I just wanted to bring out the clinical correlation about should you be abusing, PPIs, because they cause a whole lot.
Sorry, Shabnam, actually I had lost contact.
Yeah. So Vijay, I was talking about the mucosal line.
I'm sorry, I actually lost contact.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So you can't hear us. Folks, I'm really...
I know, now you can...
Okay. Sorry, those are problems beyond our control, technology.
It doesn't matter. Can you tell me the question again?
Yeah. So Vijaya, what I was saying is the mucosal thickness of the mucosal lining would be one of the things that impact mucosal immunity, right? The gut mucosal lining. And I was talking about the abuse of PPIs like omeprazole, lansoprazole, all these drugs, which affect the mucosal lining. So that would also be an impact on the mucosal immunity. Just wanted to highlight that, because people sometimes, I know many of my patients have been taking PPIs for years. Like it's like a prop. They don't want to give it up, but they feel that it's something that's helping me. Sometimes it may not be. So anyway, PPI is a different story. So moving further ahead, the gut microbiome is impacted by diet, sleep, stress. These are the three main ones. So Debojyoti and Vijaya, I would like you all to talk about those three impacts. Food is number one. So I'll talk about what food can do and cannot do, but both of you please feel free to add to that. So Debojyoti, these are the three things that we want to talk about today. There are, of course, a lot of other things. We can talk until, a long, long time. Sleep, stress, food are the main ones, because those are the ones that are impacted in a big way now with the COVID-19 situation. So Debojyoti, would you say something about the sleep and the stress?
Yeah, stress, definitely. I mean, see, the thing is, so gut microbiota, one of the major roles of gut microbiota is not only metabolizing, food, but it also helps us, provide with a lot of vitamins. In fact, you'll be surprised that serotonin is a major, mood uplifter or a neurotransmitter. Much of the serotonin is actually produced in the gut, and there are serotonin receptors in the gut as well. Of course, there's a debate whether the serotonin produced in the gut can cross the blood-brain barrier and impact the brain, but that's for the research to look into. But the fact that there's definitely a link between the mood and the gut, and that's where the very famous the gut-brain axis also comes in. There are plenty of reports, research, where people have looked at the vagus nerve and how that impacts the gut. There are reports where the metabolites secreted by the microorganisms in the gut influence the brain. You talk about Alzheimer's, you talk about Parkinson's. Everything has some association with the gut. Now, brain. When I say brain, it's a very complicated organ. We all know that. When you eat good food, when you are not feeling good, you feel butterflies in the stomach. When you eat good food, you feel happy. So how does it happen? So these are the these are some things which every one of us experiences in life. And that goes to show how these impact the gut microbiota. So food, as Dr. Kar you were mentioning, gut microbiota, unlike your genome, is much more malleable. So that means it can change. You can modulate the gut microbiota. You cannot modulate or you cannot change your genome. So for example, there are many tests which people do, which they look at the variance in a particular gene, right? And then that is correlated with whether you are a good caffeine metabolizer, so you can have more coffee or less coffee, and so on and so forth. It works, definitely, but there are issues with respect to the race, how the variant will work in a particular community versus the other community. Whereas in the gut microbiota, a particular food will impact a particular microorganisms in the same way. That's why Mediterranean diet, and the reports are pretty fresh now. It has been shown that Mediterranean diet is very good for your health. Primarily, one of the ways it helps is through your gut microbiome. Similarly, drugs that we take. So PPIs is what you had mentioned, but there's a drug that I think all diabetologists love to give, that is metformin. Metformin is again known to cause positive effects in the gut microbiome. There's a very well-known bacteria called Akkermansia mucinifila. Now, this particular microorganism is known to be very, very beneficial for the health, and metformin is known to increase Akkermansia mucinifila. So what I'm trying to say is, not only your food, your stress level, your drugs, everything play a role in modulating the gut microbiota and thereby modulating our health and wellness.
Thank you, Debojyoti. So a comment I wanted to add,
Very interesting.
Sleep, was because I receive, WhatsApp messages at times, which I know in India is like the middle of the night and everyone is either on social media or something. And my concern is, not prioritizing sleep is very bad for the immune system. So in fact, I sent a message to somebody, sleep loss and your immune system are not good friends. So the point I wanted to highlight is, with sleep, there are two kinds of problems. One kind is the type of people who do not prioritize sleep. And I think that is happening quite a lot with a lot of people now, because they don't have to go out in the morning anywhere, all that stuff. So it's easy to binge watch TV or, something like that, or be on social media, whatever it is that is for you. Or you might be, staying up late at night, communicating with your family or anything. But the fact is, sleep loss does have very adverse effects on your immune resilience. That is what I wanted to highlight. So my goal is, please prioritize your sleep. If there is one thing you want to do for your own resilience, please prioritize sleep. So at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And it's not 7 to 8 hours of time in bed. Anyway, I can talk about sleep and all that on a different, we have actually done one event recently. So sleep loss is not good for your immune system. That is the message I wanted to mention. And the other thing is stress. Now, stress we can talk until kingdom come. It's like, it's not just the stress, it's also how you deal with the stress, which is very important. So the gut bacteria and food, again, we can talk until, for a long time. My basic, very simple recommendation is eat real food. Eat food that maybe your great grandparents or your grandparents knew as food. And that food did not come out of boxes and bags. That is number one. Number two, particularly for for the Indian people, insulin resistance is such a big problem, being pre-diabetic. And that is directly related to how much of carbohydrates you are eating. And carbohydrate is not an essential nutrient. And interestingly, the gut bacteria provide, how many is it? 23 different enzymes for the digestion of carbohydrates. So at this point in time, sugar is not your friend. These are the few things I just wanted to mention. For that matter, neither are non-caloric sweeteners, but we can go on and on. So those affect the gut microbes in a very bad way. So if you think that you're not having the table sugar, the regular sugar crystals, and you're going to have, one of these others like sucralose or aspartame, you're probably not doing the right thing, because those can mess up your gut microbes completely. So sugar is not your friend. And Vijaya, would you like to add a little bit more about, the high carbohydrate diet and its impact on the immune system and the entire immunometabolism? We can go on and on forever. This conversation is so interesting.
A few things which I would like to add to what Dr. Dhar said is the first paragraph of Western-Taylor Physiology, which we read way back, said that the first neurological mechanism of digestion starts the moment you smell the food.
Right.
Sorry, Vijaya's connection has... Vijaya, I'm very sorry, we can't hear you. I'll just send a message on chat. So...
So, Shabnam, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear.
Hello, can you hear?
We can hear now. We missed the last bit that you were saying. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, well, what I was saying was the neurological mechanism of digestion starts the moment you smell the food. So the gut-brain axis is summed up in that first one particular sentence of Western-Taylor gastroenterology chapter. It's the first sentence which is written in Western-Taylor. That's one. And the second thing, when it comes to sleep, melatonin is a very important sleep hormone. All of us know. It starts, the melatonin production starts at around 6 p.m. in the evening. It peaks at around 10:30, remains plateaued for some time, and by 1:30 or so in the night, middle of the night, it starts coming down, so that by 6 in the morning, it has already touched the baseline. It has come down. When are you supposed to catch your sleep? Unless you hit your bed at 9:30, 10:30, your melatonin is at peak. If you miss the boat then, if you are in front of the blue light of your mobile, blue light is a melatonin inhibitor. So you are going to be in a state of a perpetual jet lag. You are in India, but you are living the life of somebody who is in US. You are in a state of a perpetual jet lag. What happens to your immune system then? It's seen that all the, like tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha, there is something called IL-18, interleukin 18, which is produced by gut epithelial cells and gut immune system. This is a cytokine produced by the gut immune system. IL-18 production increases. And IL-18 is responsible for all the gastritis associated with late night or overnight awakening. You have not slept for long, you have been going around eating wrong food, so IL-18 production increases. At the same time, there is another cytokine which is produced by the gut and otherwise all the other cells of the body also. IL-18 is also produced by numerous other cells and numerous other epithelial surfaces. IL-10 is an inhibitor of inflammation. It is an anti-inflammatory cytokine. IL-18 is a pro-inflammatory cytokine. Whenever one increases, the other reduces. So if there is an increased IL-18 production, IL-10 reduces. And it has been seen that when melatonin production increases, IL-10 production also increases. So if you sleep well, you digest your food well, you have an anti-inflammatory cytokine circulating in your body. So the risk of all the autoimmune diseases are low. The risk of all the...
Sorry, Vijaya, we lost you. So while Vijaya joins us back, I'm just going to add 2 comments on melatonin. So melatonin is a chemical produced by the pineal
inflammation
body. Sorry, Vijaya,
I lost the connection again.
We lost your connection, so I started talking about melatonin. No, will you just repeat what you said the last minute?
No, I just said that melatonin, as the concentration of melatonin increases, IL-10 production also increases. So when you have good melatonin, you are sleeping well, you have an anti-inflammatory cytokine in your circulation, you have less risk of auto-inflammatory disease, all the infections which you are having is taken care of by IL-10. So you have an anti-inflammatory cytokine. The entire milieu is anti-inflammatory. So you're going to do well. That's
Thank
what
you.
I was trying to
Thank you, Vijaya. That is excellent. So melatonin, I was just talking about what is melatonin. So melatonin is a substance produced naturally in your body by the pineal gland. And as we age, our melatonin levels fall. But what we are doing to our melatonin levels because of our lifestyle is actually way more significant. So melatonin is secreted, as Vijaya mentioned, during the day and released in the evening. And the other thing that Vijay is talking about, I didn't know the mechanisms of how melatonin was like so beneficial for the immune system. So melatonin works as an antioxidant also. And Vijay has explained the IL-10 pathway. That is very interesting. So the next thing that I want to mention is that doesn't mean you just take a melatonin supplement and everything is going to be hunky-dory. No, there are natural ways of managing your melatonin levels first. That is what in my practice we recommend. Prioritize sleep. So excessive daylight or the artificial light that we subject ourselves to from our devices or even at home actually, that is also something that impacts your melatonin levels. That is one of the biggest ones. And the other thing is if you are reading, in bed, you're using lighted backlit devices, you get a lot of devices which are cheap and not backlit. So maybe, or if you can actually get physical books, which at this point with the COVID-19, electronic version would be probably better. So make sure that, to manage your melatonin levels better, the work has to start earlier on in the day. It's not just 1 hour before bedtime, I decide, okay, now I need to dim down the lights. It needs to start earlier. But one of the things I recommend to people is, why not have a switch off device time, like I call a sort of time. So if you have the option of switching off your lighted backlit devices, set a time. And nowadays phone settings are so wonderful, you can get it done on that. And if you don't have an option of switching off your devices, it's related to your work or whatever, there are some apps, and I'll post the link. One is called the Flux, which you can have working in the background of your laptop or your phone as well, which would reduce. So the basic goal is to reduce the light exposure for you. Then you get the blue blocking glasses and all those things. But my point is, if you are thinking that I'm just going to take a melatonin supplement, yes, some people will need a supplement, but I'm just going to take a melatonin supplement and not bother with the backlit devices or any of these things, it may not be the best thing. So that is fantastic, Vijay, your explanation of melatonin and how it impacts the immune system. So we have actually gone over our time. So I'm just going to conclude with what are the things we discussed today. One is Vijay explained, and Devojyoti and Vijay, both of them explained so beautifully. Thank you so much for their explanations of the immune system and the gut-lung axis. That is so important. And the other thing that I wanted to focus on more is what are the things you can do to affect your immune system, rather to help your immune system build your resilience. If I want to deliver two messages, one is sleep, prioritize your sleep. And next thing is, what are you eating? Like, I know it's very difficult when you're at home and you have access to food that are probably not the best for you. And these are the two big ones. And another thing to that I will add is, are you looking at eating in shortened intervals of time? So time restricted eating. And again, we don't have time to get into that. So if you're eating in a shortened interval of time, that is way more anti-inflammatory rather than, munching the whole day and night. And people do that. I'm sure many of you are thinking, I'm not one of those. You need to track it. You'll be surprised at what you see. So that is one thing. The other thing I wanted to mention is, Devojyoti mentioned the Mediterranean diet. Now for Indians, Mediterranean diet is not something that they would normally, embrace. But few things I wanted to highlight on the Mediterranean diet was, one of the things is, it does not include sugar. And Mediterranean diet is not just having olive oil. It's also the way of life, and they don't eat processed food. So there's no processed food in the Mediterranean diet. And the other thing is it is lower in carbohydrates than what we are used to. And I can talk until kingdom come about, most Indians have not changed what they eat traditionally. So if I'm in India, I'm still eating rice. That's a question I get very often, or roti. But the fact is the production of rice has undergone a lot of change, and the production of all these other grains as well. So the metabolic response you are getting from that same food, which you think is the same traditional food that you've been eating since, your grandparents have been eating, that has undergone a big change. So the metabolic response is different. And obviously, if the metabolic response is different, your immune system impact is very different. So it's not just, oh, I'm just still eating my traditional food, dosa and idli and, rice or roti. That has not changed. The name has not changed, but it has undergone other kind of changes. So the metabolic response and the immune response to many of those things is different. And one more thing that both of you have been talking about is the receptor. I think we need to have a separate, conversation about all those antihypertensive medications and what are they doing? Should they be, stopped? Should they not be stopped? Are they helping? Are they harming? That's for another episode. I'm sure our, audience, clinicians in the audience would love to know more about that. So, yes,
Dr. If I can add one more line on the food thing. It's always better to have more fiber in the food, especially when you are looking at the gut microbiota. And there are reports, because many of the fibers actually help increase what we call as good bacteria. For example, B. fragilis and segmented filamentous bacteria. And taking a cue from Dr. Vijaya, segmented filamentous bacteria increases Tregs or T regulatory cells, and helps in Th17 differentiation. Now, both of these activities, lead to better, immunotolerance. So just to add, how food can modulate the gut microbiota and hence the immune system is also very, very important. Sorry, doctor.
Thank you, No, you're absolutely
wonderful.
Right. Thank you, Devajyoti. So about the comment on fiber, now that doesn't mean you take a fiber supplement. We would much rather you get your fiber from real food. So vegetables contain a lot of fiber. And if you are going to, have only the orange juice and not the whole orange, that is a very different metabolic response. We don't recommend you juice. Juice is not a healthy food. So I can go on and on. So Vijaya and Devajyoti, last few comments on what we talked about today, and I'll conclude. Vijaya, over to you.
All I can say is at this juncture, we have come across a virus which will teach you more immunology than an immunologist would actually know. So as you come across the disease spectrum, what we need to do is we have to change ourselves based on how the virus behaves. Otherwise, the virus will have much of us rather than we having control over the virus. That's very important. So the basics we already know, washing hands and all those things which we have been talking about, all these things we already know. But we also need to know something is there are a lot of, Corona OX43 strain is a normal commensal carrier of our nostril. It's there. But when this Corona OX43 gets replaced by COVID-19, that is when you get SARS-CoV-19. Otherwise, you would not get it. So,
sorry about that. Yeah. So
all that we need to go a long way with you.
Vijaya,
because that commensal is actually going to protect.
Vijaya, I'm very sorry.
Okay.
Here the last minute. Will you just repeat that?
Yeah. So what I was saying is we have a lot of commensals in our nostril. So please don't touch your nose and don't pick your nose. Let the commensal be there. As long as that mucosal barrier doesn't get disrupted, these commensals will stay there and prevent the pathogenic organisms to gain the root. Because if Corona OX43 is there, it will not allow Corona SARS-CoV-19 to take COVID-19 to take the place. So that is very important. We have to maintain the mucosal barrier. That's very, very important. Another most important mucosal barrier which disruption has been seen with aerated drinks. And they have seen that entire mucosal barrier, especially with coronaviruses. I just chanced upon something today where they have done a simple experiment with aerated drinks, and they have seen that it disrupts the mucosal barrier for, of course, we know it disrupts the mucosal barrier, but it the permeability or invasiveness of the mucosa to COVID was increasing with this thing. So we knew about it. It is just that we need to practice it. That's all.
Thank you, Vijaya. So Debajyoti, some last comments?
Yeah, I mean, taking a cue from you, I mean, eat well, sleep well, eat diverse food, don't restrict to one kind of food. I know with lockdown that might be a problem, but still, I mean, the better of the quality of food is very important. It's not the quantity. So the more the diverse kind of food you can have, just increase the repertoire of your microbiome, because as Dr. Vijay was saying, these are commensals. They also play a protective role. They actually fight against the pathobiomes. So just increase the reservoir of these good microorganisms by having good food, good sleep, and be happy.
Thank you, Debajyoti and Vijaya. So in conclusion, stay safe, wash your hands. So as Calgary Mayor said, and I'm probably paraphrasing it, clean hands, sharp brain, and a hopeful heart. So that is what I am wishing for all of you. We will go through this together and we will have answers from science. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kar. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.